Hi, good evening. My name is Sonia Diaz. I'm the president of HPRA National. We're so proud to welcome everybody today to HPRA's session that's focused on unpacking the topic of disinformation, its pervasive presence in our communication channels, and how it negatively is impacting civic engagement and the democratic process in Hispanic communities across America. And I'm sure that I would be hard pressed to find one person with us today that has not somehow been affected in their families, jobs, or relationships by this issue. So it doesn't really surprise me, the large attendee roster that we have today. So we're really excited that you guys really want to talk about this. As communicators, many of us are tasked with engaging audiences in the multicultural space. So this is a critical topic due to the devastating implications this can have on our professions and the future of journalism as a whole. For those of you who aren't familiar with HPRA, we're the premier organization for Hispanic PR professionals and or anyone doing work that engages Latino audiences and Latino issues. Our goal here is to develop, grow, and guide the effort that will create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive industry workforce. And part of that work is focused on discussing important issues that are affecting our industry, like the ones we will discuss today. This year, HPRA, we're celebrating our 35th anniversary. We have 7 local chapters, including Los Angeles, Orange County, New York, Miami, Texas, and the Carolinas, as well as a student chapter that works to train and mentor our next generation of Hispanic professionals in the industry. So we invite you to visit our website to learn more about our programs and our leadership opportunities. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or our LinkedIn page or our LinkedIn group for some of our latest updates and events and things that are happening. For our forums, we try to offer a dynamic conversation versus a rigid format of Q&A that just goes down the line of speakers. So with that in mind, we encourage you to place your questions in the chat, and our moderator and or our panelists will address them as we go along. If you're attending the forum as a reporter, please make sure to identify yourself and your outlet with the question in the chat so that someone from the HPRA team can make sure to flag it. And finally, tonight's conversation can be followed through our Twitter handle at HPRA USA or the hashtag HPRA Media. So I'm going to put all of those things in the chat for you guys so you can check those out. And I guess lastly, I want to let you guys know that even though we're going through 8 o'clock, Congressman Gallego does have a hard stop of 7:30. So we want to try to take as much advantage of his time while he's here. But to get things started, I'm going to introduce Adrian Carrasquillo, political reporter for Newsweek. I'm very proud to say that I've known Adrian, I think, basically, respectively in our careers. We've kind of come up together over the years. He started his career, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me, Adrian, but I believe he started his career as a reporter at Fox News Latino. And then he was at NBC Latino when they launched that channel. He covered the White House for BuzzFeed. And now he's at Newsweek covering politics and how they intersect with the Hispanic community. So I'm really proud to have him here today. And I'm really proud to call him a friend. So I'm going to turn everything over to you now, Adrian. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sonia. And I've known Sonia, she stole my thunder a little bit. I've known her for a long time, and I know she's passionate about these issues, and you can tell by the panel she's put together today. It's a great group of folks. And so, look, I think this is a great opportunity to discuss and dig into the issue of disinformation in Spanish language media that affects Latinos and Latino voters, obviously, in key states like Florida. And it's an issue that I think folks want to understand more about. So before we dig into that, I do want the panelists to introduce themselves. We have a really, really great panel, and I'm not just saying that, really great folks who know this stuff and are steeped in these issues. So if you want to start, maybe Evelyn, if you want to start, introduce yourselves.
Well, thank you, Hispanic Public Relations Association, Sonia, Adrian, and our esteemed panelists and leaders, Congressman Ruben Gallego, Andrea Mercado, and Jose Parra. It is such an honor to be here. My name is Evelyn Perez-Verdia. I'm the CEO of We Are Más, and also on my free time, I am an anti-disinformation advocate. I just would like to say we're not an intelligence community, what you see here. Many of us do not get paid to do this work. Our only payment is hoping that us exposing what we will see And one day, hope, and what we continue to see, one day we allow the minds of our communities to be free of the psychological cancer that this is spreading here in the United States and around the world. And this premeditated evil is called disinformation. So we look forward to sharing with you today what we know.
Congressman.
Thank you. My name is Congressman Ruben Gallego. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I represent the 7th District of Arizona. I'm also the chairman of BoldPAC. Prior to that, I was in the State House. Currently, I'm also the chairman of the Subcommittee on Intelligence and Special Operations. In that capacity, I actually do deal with misinformation, disinformation, gray zone warfare, and things of that nature that are very much reminiscent of what I saw in not just South Florida, but other parts of the country when it comes to Spanish language misinformation. And we'll talk more about that. Other than that, I'm a very proud Phoenician. Have been a member of Congress, as I said, now it's going into my 7th year. And we're very happy I'm very happy to run again. So glad to be here and glad to be helpful however I can.
And if there's anybody who's muted, non-panelists who should maybe mute yourselves, there's a little bit of feedback coming in. Andrea, could you introduce yourself?
Andrea Cristina Mercado. I'm the co-executive director of Florida Rising, the result of the union of New Florida Majority and Organized Florida, 2 organizations that have a decade of power building and community organizing in the Sunshine State. I've been community organizing in the immigrant rights movement and movements for racial equity and women's rights for the last 20 years. And really excited to join this conversation tonight from an organizing and social movement perspective.
And last but certainly not least, Jose.
Thank you. My name is Jose Parra. I am the CEO of Prospero Latino. We're a communications firm focused on the Latino market. Prior to this, I used to work with Senator Harry Reid as Senior Advisor for Communications, and I started my career as a reporter in South Florida, working at the Herald and the Sun Sentinel. So the issue of disinformation coming from a reporter, from a reporting journalism background, is quite near and dear to me, and quite ashamed to see what's happening in the airwaves here in our state. Something that deeply affects, I think, our democracy, where the right to have fact-based information should be a right, not simply a privilege for a few.
This is great. You know, I thought we could start with defining what we're even talking about. When we hear disinformation, misinformation, you know, there's a lot of great professionals that are watching this, but they may not be steeped in it the way you guys are that deal with this day in and day out. So I know that Evelyn wanted to start a little bit on this, but anybody else feel free to jump in. What are we talking about when we're talking about disinformation? Does that include conspiracy theories? And I think, what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Well, you know, it's really interesting because a lot of people are talking about South Florida and they're like, well, the misinformation that's happening in South Florida. I'm like, no, espera un momentico here, because what we're seeing is disinformation. It is shared with the intent to harm. Now, people who are sharing this are sharing misinformation because they are unknowingly sharing it, which also happens. So that's the beginning of this. We're seeing that the disinformation, actually, the first time I saw disinformation was on October 1st, 2018, in a WhatsApp channel of a Colombian American leader that was, in that time, respected by Democrats and Republicans. And what was allowed was a video from this man who said, come and join our YouTube channel so you can understand the difference between Andrew Gillum, the socialist, and Ron DeSantis, the capitalist. And from there, they have doubled down.
And does anybody else sort of want to jump in on that kind of early portion?
Look, so when you've seen disinformation, at least done by foreign governments, what it does, it takes kernels of truth and twists them to the point where it spreads and gets seeded among different groups that then share it, right? And it's very hard to stop it once it goes originally from the original spread. The other thing is the conduit is almost as important as the actual lie. Many times what you actually see is in terms of proper distribution of disinformation is you have people that kind of get their reputation first in some other areas and then shift to the disinformation. So for example, you'll have people that start WhatsApp channels with their friends and a huge group, and they'll be talking about, hey, here's some helpful tips to save money, or you should donate to this charity, or be aware of this. So they actually create and cultivate an audience, and then slowly they start kind of seeping in the disinformation. So you kind of see that happening in South Florida, especially with some of these Colombian conservative senators. But I've seen this happening in Russia, for example, when Russians are trying to really send disinformation in the Donbass Ukrainian region. It's almost the same exact thing, almost the same exact methodology.
I was thinking, I don't have to tell this crowd why analyzing and understanding this issue is important for Democrats, but I'll do it anyway. Ekis had these numbers, right, from 2016 to 2020. Biden dropped 14 points in Cuban precincts in Miami-Dade County compared to Hillary Clinton's numbers, 20 points in majority Latin American districts in Miami-Dade, and 11 points in Osceola, which has a robust Puerto Rican presence. So, I wanted to go to the Congressman, but anybody else also feel free to jump in. You've been active on this issue, Congressman. You're the first Colombian American in Congress. This stuff really matters to you. I wanted to know sort of what are some of those early steps that Congress has taken, that you've taken. I know you've been on this issue and you've sent various letters and things like that. Sort of, people probably want to know, like, what is Congress doing on this front?
Well, it's unfortunate that Congress really can't do much on this front, because you're also, neighboring in an area of free speech. Now, if there's foreign governments that are getting involved, then that's a different story. And certainly I've been very vocal with the conservative element of the Colombian government, specifically talking to Ambassador Santos, sending letters to Duque, and just personally calling out a lot of these conservative members of Congress that are engaging in electoral politics. But until you really start moving into an actual foreign government interfering in our election, it becomes very difficult. The most important thing we could do with BOLPAC is that we actually are now trying to stop the cycle where we actually see the initiation of disinformation starting and then spreading, because we've been able to see that there's really a handful of 4 or 5 Latino political operatives in South Florida that really are getting their marching orders, or getting their own marching orders. And then they put it on their own YouTube channels, which then spreads into the AM radio, which then is reinforced by local politicians, which validate a lot of this misinformation. So whenever we see something that's about to pop, we actually will call out that misinformation. I think that's something that we need to be doing as often as possible. I want to point out the bigger danger isn't just the electoral problems of this, right? This is not just a problem because Democrats will lose because of misinformation. And there is actual interesting studies that, like, when Democrats or liberals try to do misinformation in reverse, it actually doesn't work. And there's a lot of cultural reasons why that is. But the bigger danger is because misinformation crosses over into other areas. So, for example, the same kind of channels that we're talking about, the Democrats being socialists, were also the ones that are running anti-vaccine conspiracies, anti-maxing conspiracies, which ends up, potentially costing a lot of our, bad health outcomes for our Latino community, right? And once any society becomes susceptible to disinformation or misinformation, really, they're going to be susceptible to all types of people. It's like weakening your immune system, right? You weaken your immune system to a cold, you will also be weakening your immune system to a flu, right? So when you can make someone a sucker because you make them believe everyone's a socialist, then it's the likelihood of them believing that COVID vaccine is not good for you will also be increased. The likelihood of you buying into some Ponzi scheme is also very high, things of that nature. And that's a very dangerous situation in our society, especially our Latino society, which is, very, and sometimes very isolated and does not have easy access to answers.
Andrea, I wanted to turn to you. I think this is a good segue to the report that you guys released, disinformation in Miami after the Capitol insurrection. What was the goal of the report and what did you find?
Yeah. Well, I think first in 2020, we all did so much work around the election. As an organization that's focused on expanding democracy, we registered over 100,000 people to vote. We had over 500,000 conversations with Latinos, encouraging them to get out to vote. And then we saw all of the disinformation and how it was impacting the election, from reports that the Proud Boys would know how you voted and would beat you up if you didn't vote for Donald Trump, to the cries of election fraud. And after the election, we knew that this was a major problem that we were going to have to confront. And during the insurrection, we kept getting all of these stories of whether it was my abuelita or one of our members telling us about what was being said on Spanish language radio. And that's why we came together with Jose from Prospero Latino and with Latina Comunica and the Miami Freedom Project to how do we actually record what was being said on Spanish language radio from that week, from January 6th to January 13th, and actually document the level of disinformation that was being spread, not just by these radio hosts, but conspiracy theories that were being legitimized by congresspeople, by Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart and Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar. Just really troubling statements that, we thought it was really important to capture, document, and expose and demand some accountability around.
Jose?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest reasons we did this report, we started working on this report, was that everybody in this community knew what was happening on the airwaves, all the type of disinformation that was being spread, whether it was saying that COVID was a conspiracy to undermine President Trump, or like Congressman Maria Elvira Salazar said, that there were 200,000 more votes than there were voters in Pennsylvania. That sort of information, everybody knew that was being spread, but we didn't have a way to actually point out to it and show the evidence. Here it is. So that's the reason we started working on this report, and we only documented 1 week, and our report is about 21 pages long with numerous instances, not one or two, but numerous instances of disinformation. So that tells you the level of the problem that we have down here, and which we are afraid will wind up spreading to other areas of the country, where they might not use socialism as the rallying cry, but they might use issues like the vaccine or government control of your life, using it with evangelical communities or religious communities.
Congressman, you were at the Capitol on that day, and you talked about having to fall back on your Marine training and thinking you were going to have to fight your way out. I mean, your experience underscores that this is not a joke in any way. I'm curious what your reaction is to the stuff you're seeing in this report. You guys were dealing with that, your safety and danger, and there's these hosts saying wild things on Spanish language airwaves. But of course, the follow-up to that is, what do you do, or how is that counteracted in such a serious instance?
Well, certainly, at least when it comes to some of these politicians, not just Maria Salazar, Carlos Jimenez especially, we will have to make that an issue in an election season. They believe that somehow, because they live in a bifurcated language world, that they can say whatever they want on conservative Spanish radio, that somehow it won't cross over into main media, or that we as the opposition won't catch it. Well, haha, I speak Spanish, so guess what? I got you. But number two, we need to make sure that, again, we try to stop the cycle of this moving in other areas. I know, for example, here in Arizona, I've been setting up individual vaccine clinics, and we go door to door and talk to families. We're hearing the same conspiracies that we hear in some, white, poor, uneducated neighborhoods, or people that choose to be not take vaccines, that there's microchips, that there's something wrong with this vaccine, right? So the misinformation is starting to spread. It's not just going to be located in South Florida and down there. And lastly, I take it personally. Like, I was one of the last persons to leave that floor. I had to contemplate, fighting my way out of something that I had not experienced. It's been 15 years since I last was in my last firefight. And this was the closest, since those 15 years. And it's horribly irresponsible for any politician to somehow diminish what happened that day. And again, I think there's going to be some political consequences to that. And then lastly, what I saw on January 6th was not entirely too different what I used to see in Iraq, where crowds would get stirred up by, clerics or by other, so-called insurgent leaders, through misinformation. I remember going into towns and there'd be flyers going out about how we were kidnapping people. things of that nature. So it was very similar. As a matter of fact, I can't remember who said it, but a couple of days before January 6th, I was watching TV, and someone commented that the language and rhetoric they were hearing around January 6th is very similar to what that he had heard in Rwanda, prior to the purge that occurred there. And that really tipped me off, because I was not entirely surprised what happened on January 6th. And it's sad to say that that was even something that could occur in this country, but it did. And we need to remember that, and these politicians can't memory hold this.
The congressman said something interesting, which is that, some politicians, some Republicans are able to say something in English and say something different in Spanish, right? And Jose, I wanted to ask you, is it also, do conspiracy theories and things, do they come from the English world? Can they be sort of pervasive and then go into the Spanish language as well?
Certainly. I mean, you have stuff that originates in the world of QAnon, easily crossing into Spanish language media and being preached like gospel. I think the whole issue of tying, for example, COVID to a conspiracy against the president and minimizing the impact of that horrible pandemic that we've all suffered, I think it's a good example of that. And even more troubling for me is exactly what the congressman was saying. When you have actual sitting members of Congress going on and legitimizing this sort of fringe stuff that's originating in the netherworld of the internet, and allowing it to become facts by a matter of repetition, I think it's a huge disservice to our democracy, to our public health, our public safety.
And Evelyn, I wanted to go to what you guys have touched on a little bit, socialism and communism, right? We've seen Republicans, from the ones that wouldn't know Latino issues if they smack them in the face, to the ones that are really know what they're talking about and have frankly helped beat Democrats, in states like Florida. Socialism, communism kind of becomes the catch-all. They're just like, this is something that we can use against Democrats. I was wondering if you could talk to me about the interplay there with disinformation and what you sort of saw in the 2020, obviously before and in 2020.
Well, Jose, first of all, I would like to say Jose is absolutely right in terms of the use of disinformation. One of the WhatsApp channels that I was invited to was about COVID-19, like Jose mentioned, and it was fascinating because it all starts with trust. It starts with people they trust, inviting them to a WhatsApp channel, or now Telegram channels. But they go into these channels and they say, look, and it was really painful, because they said, our community is suffering from hunger, which was true. Our community doesn't have food. Our community doesn't have employment. How can we help them? And then they would go, we can help them here, there. And then after a month, they started putting anti-vaccination in a VIP COVID leadership channel.
Wow.
And that's when my heart stopped, because, I think many of us in this that are here, we've worked so hard in Florida for our communities to get information. In 2014, I remember signing a letter with 100 leaders asking both parties to have bilingual communications directors, so we could give information to the communities about what it meant to be a Republican and a Democrat in that time. And it's so sad to see people use this information as now the mainstream for the United States. And it comes down to that. This is not our RD and PA issue. This is an issue that is hurting our society, our loved ones, and is weakening our democracy. But most important, I think that there's a big connection with religion, and also, like one of my friends and colleagues and someone who spoke recently about that, like Dan Restrepo, said, this is very much part of the immigrant and first generation environment too. So we have to understand that second, third, fourth generation Latinos, for example, the word progressive has a beautiful history in this country. It means something completely different than what it means in Latin America. For many first-generation Latin Americans, progresista is connected to socialism and communism. And I want to be blunt about this because our messaging is going to be important in 2022. They are using first generation, what people see in the lens of their countries, as words that affect them and connecting them to what the party or the Democratic Party is. And I think it's important in this moment to start using the word that we are pro-democracy here in the United States or anywhere in the world. And they are going to use it. I've been hearing it in the channels and in different programs. They're starting to say los progresistas radicales because it's a word that we use. And standing away, there's still Castro Chavista and Socialista, but that's the word they're starting to use now more than the others.
Does anyone want to jump in on the socialism and communism piece?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's a hit that is ubiquitous, right? Because basically it characterizes, policies without actually it being, so concentrated that it's hard for you to reject it, right? So for example, I'm sure a lot of, people are afraid of the word socialism. At the same time, many of these people are on Medicare, right? Or Social Security. So, it's a way that, they get to have, and when I say they, the people that are the disinformation kind of purveyors get to live in the best of both worlds, right? They still get to give these types of social programs, but still get to, scare them away at the same time, right? It's going to be interesting, I think, what happens when the extra supplemental starts moving in July to a lot of these communities, right? Will they consider themselves communists because they're receiving an extra $300 per kid? But that aside, the biggest reason why it works is also because you need to have an active campaign to be pushing back against this, right? And I'm not a Florida expert, but I've been campaigning in Florida since 2010 in one manner or another. And what I have seen many times, unfortunately, is that when it comes to Spanish communications on the political side, they only start up on election years. There is never, ever an ongoing political operation by either the Democratic Party, progressives, or just nonprofits in general. So that way the vacuum isn't filled in other, by other things. And one of the reasons why I think Arizona hasn't moved as much as other states when it comes to Latino votes is because we are actively involved politically year in and year out in Spanish language, door to door, and activism. So as a matter of fact, we just saw a stat that the Latinos moved 2% towards Trump this last cycle, which we think that's actually not out of the norm considering he's an incumbent compared to other areas. And until I think the Florida, the Democratic Party, the Progressive Party, that all these nonprofits understand that Latinos are a swing group, not a base group, and they need to be treated as such, you're going to have disinformation continue to thrive for quite a while down there.
I do want to get to a listener or watcher question of your question, but I did want to ask you guys sort of, what do you say to your Republican friends or non-political folks who say it's not misinformation to say Democrats are embracing socialism more than before? I've heard that from Republican sources of mine, some who don't really like Trump, but they say, hey, Latinos are not stupid. Like, it's a little, they think that it's not fair to say it's misinformation, that Democrats are embracing socialism more. I just wanted to throw that to you guys.
By the way, I'd like to point out, oh, sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
It's clearly disinformation to say that Joe Biden is a socialist. I think one of the things that's really clear to us in Florida is we can't just say what we're not. We actually have a messaging problem where we have to say what we are for. And the reality is we've been wildly successful with progressive ballot initiatives, the first $15 minimum wage in the South, amendment for returning voting rights to returning citizens. And yet sometimes these progressive issues that win with over 60% of the population voting in favor, 66% of Floridians voting in favor, these very measures are measures that candidates running on a Democratic ticket distance themselves from. So I think it's very true that Democratic candidate, there's a messaging problem with the Democratic Party and people not being able to articulate what Democrats are and what Democrats are for. And we're letting the right define what the Democratic Party stands for. And I think that's a major problem and one that clearly needs to be addressed.
Congressman, you were going to say something?
Well, look, this communism, socialism argument has been around for a while, right? And you can actually make First Amendment arguments why we couldn't probably really fight it. But what I've actually seen is some of these purveyors of disinformation defend what is truly lies. For example, one South Floridian political hack I knew they were going to jump on this right away, saying that Biden was trying to stop the production of meat. Do you guys remember that earlier in the year? Because it was something that I saw on Newsmax, and I'm like, I guarantee this is going to end up down in South Florida. And sure as heck, I almost hit a swear word, that political hack started putting in Spanish that Biden was going to start banning ropa vieja, y mofongo, right, stuff of that nature. Well, when he was called out on it, because a lot of us started attacking that proposition from day one, he started pushing like, I have a First Amendment right to say this, right? So you could see where this is going. Like they feel like they have the right to lie to people. Now, the question is, can we point out the absurdity early enough so it doesn't move across the spectrum? And we have been able to do that in some regards. We just always have to be on the lookout for it. But yes, defining ourselves matter. Defining the opposition matters, but really shining light on the lies and the purveyor lies matters. And I do think that there has to be a further opportunity to this. This, at the end of the day, all goes back to money. People are making money off this too. These AM radio stations, we need to start talking to the sponsors of this show if they're going to be irresponsible purveyors of disinformation. Maybe not the political side, but certainly if they're doing things involving COVID and vaccine, I think that is something that we should be talking about to a lot of these, a lot of these people, a lot of these advertisers and advertisers.
Jane Torres actually has a great question, which is, what is being done to go to the sponsors of the radio programs as well as the corporate owners? So is that part, or have you guys seen that part, or could that be the next step, right? Of, we've seen that happen with Fox News, where they lose advertisers because of something that, Tucker Carlson said or anything like that. What do you guys think about that piece?
I'll let Jose say more, but I'll just say that there are very legitimate companies funding very illegitimate journalism.
Sad to me is, one of the sad things for me in this report is that Radio Mambi is actually owned by Univision, which has a brand based on fact-based journalism and truth-telling. And I wonder what people in the C-suites of Univision are actually thinking in regards to what is being said over their airwaves. And this matters in a huge fashion because, for example, the biggest swings that we saw in among voters, according to a poll that I saw recently, and I know Andrea knows what poll I'm referring to, were among recent arrivals, relatively recent arrivals. And these people go to these radio stations as their trusted sources of information. And the fact that you have a brand like Univision backing this up lends all this a level of credibility that it wouldn't otherwise. And it's a good question. It's time to start calling out on the corporate owners and the sponsors who are lending their brands to legitimize all this type of garbage that is being spread over the airwaves.
Adrian, if I can add to what Jose just said, it's really key because there's two good things. Well, one is not good, the other one is good.
Okay.
In terms of what they're saying, it's very clear that there are a lot of stations and people who have talked to these general managers, and they have said, well, we're not going to stop because it is a pot of gold for us. Okay. We receive a lot of money from this. This is what the radio escuchas and the people want to hear. So we are not going to stop. Now, I had a conversation with the CEO here in Broward County this weekend, who is actually, because she saw one of the journalists report about the Spanish disinformation in these programs. And she is questioning if she should invest in those stations now. So this really works. To expose disinformation really works, because at the end of the day, the people who know the importance of speaking to the communities with the truth will also back out. And we hope many do, and we should hold accountable those who don't.
So lastly, and then I don't know if there's gonna be a specific question for me, but I'm probably have to get going. I think we first have to gather information, right? We can't go to the Univisions, the Telemundos, and all these like private corporations that are funding these radio stations, for example, and say, because they're talking mean about Democrats, you need to pull your funding, right? We can't do that. That's a certain level of censorship that I don't know if I can go that far. But when we know that they're dealing with the disinformation, they're doing disinformation when it comes to QAnon, when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to other things that are outside the areas of politics. That's when I think there's a very strong argument, especially considering that the airwaves are owned by the federal government and they're supposed to be used for the benefit of people, right? Of the people. And so when we see that, when we have enough history on that, and I think this is something that maybe some of us within Bullpack and whether we're allowed to work with some of these other nonprofits that are on with me, with Jose Andrea, we should try to look at that. That might be the opportunity to do it. But there is certainly a logical argument that we can make that this is not for the greater benefit of the country that this information is being used, because it actually affects the health of the Latino community.
One thing that I'd like to add.
If I could just say something real quick, Congressman, before you leave. I think that one of the main things when you go up to DC is that this is also creating public harm. There was an insurrection. Many people left in buses from Hialeah and different places, believing that this was going to become the next Venezuela because of the disinformation. So I think that that's when it's not about the First Amendment. This is about creating public harm that has killed some police officers, killed people. And I think that that's a message for Congress. This is really affecting our communities.
And since we're talking about the First Amendment, I think one of the issues here is not about subtracting information from the airwaves, but actually adding information in the airwaves.
That's also true.
We would like for these radio hosts in the mornings, when they open up their phones to their listeners and we start hearing this flood of conspiracy theories, instead of validating them and by saying, oh, that's a very valid concern that you have, as Nelson Rubio would tell listeners in Radio Mambi, that they should actually add context to this information and say, well, this is what has been reported. These are the facts behind it. Thank you very much for your call. So this is about adding information into the debate, not subtracting for it. And it's not a question either about taking away anybody's opinion. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but the facts should be something that should be across the board.
Congressman, can I get one more for you before you go?
Yep.
So, when we talk about vaccine hesitancy among Latinos, I had a story where the Ad Council, which has done like all the famous PSAs basically in American history, was taking a big focus on Latinos. And they were talking about the messenger is just as important as the message. So, priests, doctors, people who you trust. I guess my question is that something that Democrats should think about, the messenger and the validator on these platforms? I've heard people tell me that Clinton had a better surrogate operation than Biden in places like Florida in 2016 and 2020. But I guess that's one piece where you guys are saying not just what's there, but what's missing. Is that something that you guys think about at all?
We do, and I think it's a big issue that the messenger last time was pretty much impeded also by COVID. We got to remember a lot of what happened was able to spread because of COVID-19. The usual campaigns that could have gotten started up to really be able to push back on this did not exist. The fact that Biden, didn't lock up the campaign till way later in the political year, and then even then had a very slow start because of the lack of availability to do in-person campaigning, the inability to go to door to door, even the inability to fundraise at first, that all kind of fed into this area. So we do need to have better community leaders or people that are trusted by the community to be able to push back. It does not just end up having to be politicians. I think there's a lot of other people that can be just as successful. But at the end of the day, grassroots, deep organizing that is reliable and will last throughout a campaign and afterwards is going to be stronger than a political party, or sorry, than a political leader, right? And that actually is the way that you can actually really push back on misinformation. I'll give you a good example. I've been walking my neighborhood, my precincts now, Jesus, for almost 12 years since I've started running for office. And I've known the same families forever. I've actually been able, I could go back to the same house and talk about the kids, you know, not from trajectory from 6th grade all the way to college now. Their families will call me up when they have questions, right? They will call me and they'll say, like, I heard this, can you explain this to me, right? It's not just because I'm a member of Congress, it's because like I built a relationship over years, right? What we need to do is we need to build a stronger relationship that way they're not just relying on AM radio for the information, they're relying on their local organizer that they've met for so many years. And that they know that they can reach out and ask a question, and then they will also be the spreader of the truth, which is the strongest thing you can really fight against misinformation. So that requires time and money. And the problem that you know you have in the incentives of politics is that there are more, and I'm sorry if there's any TV buyers, there's more money in TV buying than there is in paying for year-round organizers, right? You don't get a 15% margin on having really good organizers. You know, you get 15% margin for buying TV. And you know, the incentives are misaligned. But you know, that's where we need to go if we really want to be successful, I think, in places like South Florida. So I apologize, I do have to jump out. Thank you again for your time, and I look forward to working on this issue more in the future.
Thank you for joining us, Congressman.
Thank you.
Adios.
Thank you.
Guys, I don't know if you can hear, I've got a bachata party going on from neighbors, so that's just great. You know, it really brings us into the moment here. Before I move on to another subject that I have for you guys, I was curious if anybody wanted to add kind of to that COVID, the vaccine hesitancy piece. I know it was a piece that we were thinking about, the way that disinformation, misinformation also goes into once you trust somebody and all of a sudden they're telling you not to trust the vaccine. So if anybody else wanted to jump in on that, I wanted to give you the opportunity.
I mean, less on the COVID vaccines, but more in general in response to what the Congressman was sharing. I mean, I think couldn't agree more that community organizing is essential to be on the front lines to combat disinformation. We're actually launching a Promotoras de la Verdad, our Truth Warriors program, training up community leaders to go out there. And we're going to be having a door-to-door operation to ask people, have they been vaccinated? And if not, why not? And, you know, really listen to our communities to understand better, like, what are the obstacles? Is it because they're working 3 jobs, or they're worried about having to take days off because of some potential side effects? Is it because they don't know where to go? Or is it a real deep distrust in the pharmaceutical industry? And like, what is it? And give us more data and more information. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, there is no replacement for those face-to-face conversations. And I think they're really critical in combating disinformation, but so is developing infrastructure, Spanish language, year-round, you know, some more infrastructure in the ecosystem so that we can be sharing different worldviews. As Jose said, that's part of the problem in a place like South Florida, because it's surround sound right-wing ideology.
And, you know, Adrian, I'd like to add what Andrea said, which I think is super key and vital is, you know, for a long time here in Florida, a lot of people said, you know, there's like 3 people or 3 consultants that are working with the Latino community, and it's not true. Last year we did a guide, which is what the reason why I call the company We Are Mas, is called the We Are Mas Guide. And we asked over 70 Latino leaders nationwide who were the top communicators and democratic strategists in Florida. And 70% were Latinos leaders nationwide, 30% were non-Latino that were leaders. And 89 names came up. Florida has people here who understand the communities, who have built relationships for decades with this community. But the missing piece is we're begging you to not discard Florida. We need you. This is the epicenter of disinformation here in South Florida. And if there's a time to invest, it's now in information. I have so many calls from people who call me saying, Evelyn, I have a program I want to do. I have a podcast. I want to listen to the stations, but I need, a team to listen into the stations to see what they're doing, just like Andrea and Jose did. But keep an eye on what's happening and see how we can also, most importantly, what Andrea is doing. I mean, going out into the community and showing who we really are. We are promoters of democracy, like Andrea said, and we're going to fight for that. So I think that's like the ask here. We have Media Matters and Voto Latino, who now they're receiving $21 million to counter disinformation. So we really hope that you send some money down here to Florida, and we really need the support from philanthropists. If you want to support programs on radio, I mean, YouTube channels, I mean, there's so many different ways, but based on the truth. That's what we want to do. We want to base what we say on the truth, because that's what our community deserves.
I wanted to get into something, I remember being in this space since 2010. There's the census, and there's Latinos are disproportionately on social media, and they're online, right? And so we've been hearing that for over a decade at this point. And that sort of gets to how this problem and this issue that's currently going on is tied to platforms, and it's not going to go away. So X found that 64% of Latinos get their news from YouTube. But in Florida, that number is 74%, almost 3/4 of Latinos, right? So, for example, they use the example that Trump did a rare election day YouTube takeover, and Jorge Masvidal, the UFC fighter, it was the second most watched Trump video of all time. And it was him basically saying that Democrats think they have Latinos in the bag. So that was on election day, you know what I mean? And so because Latinos are disproportionately younger and they're on these platforms, I wanted to ask not just about identifying the problem, but is there a piece here of better using these platforms to effectively spread your message?
I think it all comes down to investment from the powers that be, from funders across the country, from the party itself, and the different whether it's a state party or the local party and local donors. I wanted to emphasize something that Evelyn said. Unfortunately, we saw during this past cycle a tendency to write off Florida. I read about senior members of the Biden campaign saying that Florida was more a tactical move to distract from the Midwest and actually back the Midwest. But I think winning elections without winning Florida is like riding a bike with no hands. It's possible, but there are consequences if you do that. And in order to, going back to your question, to be able to address those content issues, that requires resources, and that requires not discounting the state and investing in it in the proper manner, which has never been done.
I think I agree with that sentiment. Someone I saw in the comments brought up Libre and the massive right-wing infrastructure. We spent some time mapping the infrastructure of the right wing in Florida, and they clearly see Florida as a priority. They know that there's no path to the White House without Florida. They invest heavily. They invest in communications. They invest in organizing. They invest in services. They know in Florida, it is about the margins. If they can get 2% more of Black voters and a few more percentage points of Latinos and hope, that's how they can win the state. And they've been doing it time and time again. And I think on the other side, you see the Democratic Party, oftentimes the vast majority of the resources are coming in the last 6 weeks. I mean, really, if you look at the pattern of spending in 2020, it can make me want to cry, because it's money, millions of dollars were being spent here in Florida after most Floridians had already voted by mail or voted early. Because our vote by mail system starts so early, and because it was a pandemic, so many people were voting, weeks before election day. And I think so something does have to give, but there's also, like Evelyn said, there's like hundreds of Latino leaders here in the state, across the state, that are committed to doing something about it, because it's our families, it's our communities that are bearing the brunt of policies and elected officials that don't really care about our communities, that are prioritizing big business and not our schools and not our education, not our healthcare. And so, I think that there is we're seeing a lot of that creativity that you talked about, like the emergence of more YouTube and podcasts. I feel like every other day I hear about a new Spanish language podcast. And I think it's so great, because that's what we need, is that kind of innovation and creativity. But we are going to also need the resources, because there is opportunity. Like Latino turnout levels are still way below white and African American turnout levels. Even in 2020, when they say turnout was through the roof, we have so much room to grow. But we have to be out there contesting for hearts and minds and combating, the gross lies and disinformation that's poisoning our communities.
And I would like to add to that, Adrian, that what we see in Florida and in different places in the United States is we're seeing a serious micro-targeting, right? We see them micro-target our communities by not only culture, but also by subcultures, by accents, by things that our communities identify with. And that's the beauty of the people who we have in Florida. We have Colombianos, we have Nicaragüenses, we have Venezolanos, Boricuas, Puertorriqueños, bueno, todos, Cubanos, de todo. We have everyone here, and all of them somehow, somewhere are involved. So, we have the know-how, like Andrea said, because we live in these communities, we have the trust, we have built the trust. But the difference is that they're going to be micro-targeting these individuals. We will micro-engage these individuals. We will do it with our heart. We will do it with the truth. And that's what's going to make a difference in changing Florida and winning Florida.
And, there was a question about Libre, which Andrea referred to. I've known Libre Initiative a long time. And I know a lot of folks that, Koch-backed network funded that don't like Libre. But Libre isn't, working with pastors in Texas and giving out food. And they've done events in Florida where they're, helping people take driver's license tests. And I think that gets to what you guys were talking about, the investment piece, which is not to say that there's not, I'm sure, plenty of groups, center left, that are doing work, but the investment and what the priority is, and do people think, and do, Democratic donors think that is funders, that's worth something, that to invest now and maybe get something later down the road? I think those are important questions. Yeah. Anyway, I just want to make that comment. One thing that I think, I wrote about, broke the story in English language media of Radio Caracol being bought by America CB, and it was likened, I believe, by Evelyn to a Spanish language OAN, but people also said, Spanish language Newsmax, the firing of the popular host, the former Democratic mayor of Hialeah, Raul Martinez. How do the disinformation fears kind of extend there, and what do you think? What do you guys hope to see there? I know that it sort of seems like the sale is just going to go through, or what do you think?
Well, I think that there are several questions on the procedural side that I wouldn't necessarily say that sale will go through, or at least not very easily. As you might have seen, there are allegations of fraud and using front people in order to purchase the station, and that is not something that the FCC tolerates. And they themselves have acknowledged that they might have made some quote unquote technical mistakes. And so I think that the sale is not necessarily a fait accompli. But bringing it back to Democrats, it would be also, I would like to see somebody come up with the funds to buy a radio station down here in South Florida, where we can also have programming that counterbalances, what's coming out on out of the other side, and that is actually facts-based and using the truth above everything else.
I would like to add to what Jose said in a different perspective as a Colombian American who has listened to Caracol since I was a little girl. And I think about the man who wakes up at 6 o'clock in the morning, driving his car, listening to the same channel every day for 20 years, comes back home late at night, listening to the same channel every year. And he has no idea that things are changing in that channel, right? And at the end of the day, it starts becoming alt-right. We saw this in 2018 with a newspaper in Weston, where it was bought by people who were partisan to a party in Colombia. It was a newspaper that was here for 10 years, and then it started elevating their candidates. Also, the same with Semana in Colombia. The people who bought that say that, you know, the person who said that and it's quoted, that they want to turn Semana, which was read for a long time and respected in Colombia, as the Fox News in Espanol. So it really makes you question this and question the intent behind this buy. And especially when you think 2022 is just like 2018. It was a buy, it's a presidential election in Colombia, and it's a midterm here in Florida. And what we saw was an intersection of political strategists working for candidates in the United States, as well as candidates in Colombia.
I believe Sonia wanted to jump in with a question as well.
Yeah, I wanted to take advantage of the fact that the Libra initiative came up, and, you know, they do all the things that were mentioned here. Primarily, you know, their main focus is expanding the charter school movement and the for-profit sector and kind of taking over public education. DeSantis has made that, he made that a huge part of his campaign, and he has kept a promise on that. We've had the largest charter school expansion here. So, you know, speaking of indoctrination, today he announced that he is going to leverage the political apparatus in order to get involved in school board races. And school board races are typically nonpartisan. And honestly, they're already doing it. We saw it happen here in Miami-Dade County. And I think just as a female, as somebody who lives here in Florida, you know, and to be quite candid, what I feel is that, you know, I call them the Gilead wannabe commander goon squad is kind of taking over Florida. And just as a woman, I'm very concerned about the fact that I don't see much being done to stop these things. I mean, we had some really great school board candidates running against these folks, and they lost, and we were slaughtered. And so, you know, on top of the disinformation, what is this party going to do to stop the takeover that we're starting to see here at the local level? A lot of those Republican legislators are now running for commission seats here in Miami-Dade County.
Anyone want to take that one?
For real. I mean, I think that the danger is real. The threat of their infrastructure is real. But at the same time, I can't help thinking about the fact that, like, against all odds, like what we have been building, you know, like talking about how many people are in this conversation tonight, how many up and coming leaders have joined our forces in the last few years. I mean, we just had some incredible candidates are emerging and running with different kinds of values, like Victor Vasquez, El Boricua, who just won in Miami Springs. You know, we are seeing, you know, in spite of the uneven funding and infrastructure, like, I think there have been some really important gains that have been made. And if you look at the kind of infrastructure that we have today compared to 10 years ago, I think in Florida, we've seen a lot of growth of engagement of Latino voters and Latino communities broadly that didn't exist 10 years ago. And while there are still critiques and very valid critiques of the Democratic Party, we do have a Latino chair of the party now. So I think that there are opportunities that exist now and some infrastructure that's being built that didn't exist before, which I think indicates that we're on the right path. But obviously what happened last year in 2020 is, you know, I think shows us the extent of the problem and how much more we need to do, and that the stakes are so high, and that this work really needs to be done quickly, effectively, intentionally, strategically. But I don't know, I'm team us. I'm actually feeling pretty hopeful coming out of this conversation.
I have one more for you guys, and then please feel free to give me your your final takeaways that you have on this topic. But in terms of takeaways, Andrea, the report says, it calls for basic fact checking and explicitly citing sources and diversifying who those sources are. So some of the stuff that we chatted about today, just in terms of the folks that are watching, are there action items? Are there things that people can implement regardless of profession to kind of help fight this online or in their communities? Is there any strategies that you'd like to mention?
Well, I would say call it out. Like, I think that, we all have one of these now. We all can be a journalist somehow. We can record. We're not living in the time where we don't have anything to record. We can record everything. Like, I'm driving and I will purposefully place Lourdes de Kendall on, and Agustina Costa and Karines Moncada and all these shows, programs, and listen to what they say. And if they say something, I record it, because we all can do that. We all have to expose the lies. It's just really important, because people start losing trust in them. And I think that that's the purpose, that they go back. We need to go back to standards in this country. And that's a big piece. I mean, in Latin America, this is very common. It is very common in campaigns to use disinformation, to use rumorology, all of these tactics, even when they didn't have phones. And one of the main tactics is Facebook and WhatsApp. That's how they win campaigns in Latin America. But now it's happening here. And it's becoming doubling down. And what they're going to do, actually, and why we have to be all aware, is because it is a pot of gold that they will not let go for 2022. We will see them double down on this, and they also have the money to do so. So if you care about Florida, please invest in it. Please look at these wonderful people that have a lot to offer and a lot to do in the community, but this is the only way to make us win Florida. We have to counter it with the truth.
Jose or Andrea, do you want to jump in either with any takeaways or anything that you'd like to leave for folks?
Well, I would say that picking back off some of the comments that Evelyn just made, there is the issue of investment. What we did with the report, and I sound like a broken record on the investment front, but what we did with the report was, again, remember, it was just 1 week's worth of monitoring. This happens 365 days out of the year in this state, whether it's on radio or whether it's online. And there need to be mechanisms that are monitoring these radio stations on a regular basis, because we're never going to be able to call out the disinformation unless we are listening to it. But that requires, again, funding in order to establish a monitoring program that is effective and that can give us the tools to be able to push back against this information that's being spread. It requires funds.
Andrea, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would say for me, there's really 3 key things in addition to the monitoring and identifying those flashpoint moments where narrative change is possible. There needs to be training and capacity building. We're looking to really train more, like the Promotoras de la Verdad program and others that train people on how to spot disinformation, how to call it out, how to respond. And then lastly, just the content generation. Like, I see a lot of the chat going off on culturally competent, Spanish first content generation and distribution, and the infrastructure for distribution that's localized for our communities, for the base and for the movable middle. And I think there's a ton of really brilliant ideas that are emergent, and just really looking forward to how we work together to take it on.
Well, this is great. I mean, I think that it's been an amazingly robust and informative conversation. I've definitely learned some stuff from it. And I just want to thank you guys all for joining us, everybody who was watching. And Sonia, thank you so much for having us. I think it was really great.
I really appreciate it. I think we could go on forever and ever, but this was great. And I hope we get to talk more about this subject and other things like
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
that. Bye. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.